come real far. So I'm very hopeful about humanity. I think we can do it. And I think we're going to see a much brighter future as long as we continue to strive to come together and let love and truth and compassion guide our every action.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sylvain Rochon. I am the VP of the Alliance for Extraterrestrial Diplomatic Contact, and you are here to see another episode of Making Contact, a short series where we explore the possibilities, the ideas around formal contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. And the Alliance is a collection of different organizations, now 15 organizations that are gathered together with the same mandate. We all want to meet an extraterrestrial civilization, and our main project is to build an actual official embassy recognized by the United Nations. And we're reaching out to a whole bunch of people and other organizations, and you can contact us if you are aligned and want to support the idea of formal ED contact. We do have plenty of funds to build the embassy proper. That's not a problem. What we need is a global support effort to get the politicians aligned. So go to our website if you want to check that out. But today we're going to talk about something very special with a special guest. The question for this particular forum of Making Contact is, has there ever been evidence of extraterrestrial presence on Earth? A loaded question. Many people have so many opinions about it, but to know the truth, to know if there is actual evidence, we need to do research and investigation, because evidence is something tangible, something we can put our finger on, or touch usually, or at least explore in some way. And our guest, Preston Dennett, is an expert at evidence. Let me introduce him to you formally. He began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family and friends and coworkers were having dramatic unexplained encounters themselves. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network called MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 28 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been Amazon UFO bestsellers. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines, including Fate, Atlantis Rising, MUFON UFO Journal, Nexus Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Phenomena Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. His writing has been translated into several different languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented to in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, and Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States. He currently resides in Southern California. Welcome to Making Contact, Preston.
Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Very good. So let's go down directly to the main question, because I'm sure you have something on top of mind on how can we answer this question. Has there ever been evidence of extraterrestrial presence on Earth? And if the answer is no, I'm going to be very, very sad. But because what are we going to talk about? But it is a valid question. Has there ever been evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say I came into this field as a complete skeptic, and I assumed there was really no evidence other than eyewitness testimony. And boy, was I wrong. And I don't think people realize how much evidence there really is. Skeptics have a tendency to not examine the evidence. And I think if you have an open mind and take a look at it, you'll be quite shocked. There are mountains of evidence. And I think at this point, currently, there's conclusive evidence, really enough to hold up in a court of law. It's certainly not just eyewitness testimony. This is a big part of it. A lot of stories do sort of depend on eyewitness testimony exclusively. I will say that, but I would add that the vast majority of encounters are multiple eyewitness testimony. The average encounter has 3 to 4 witnesses. So that immediately lends a level of credibility. And there are many cases supported by lie detector tests as well. But no, it's not dependent on eyewitness testimony at all. And
Question, if you had to pick one, because I know you did a lot of research for your books, right? If you had to pick one specific case that would have, let's call it the strongest evidence, like that would hold up in the court of law, which one would you pick? And can you describe the actual case for us?
That is a really difficult question because I don't think it's really one case that will prove this phenomena. But in my own investigations, for example, there was the Coronado Island UFO incident, which occurred in March of 1994. Coronado Island is just south of San Diego, right on the border of the US and Mexico. And this is a multiple witness abduction case in which 6 or more people actually had an experience in the same place on the same night. So that's a lot of witnesses. And several of them did have medical evidence in support of their case, including one lady who was apparently implanted and had her implant removed by Dr. Roger Lear. So this is a case with actual hard physical evidence supported by multiple eyewitness testimony. That kind of case is hard to explain it away as, something else. Something obviously happened. So that's,
and like as a scientist myself, when you have such a case like that where there's an implant that wasn't supposed to be there, and I'm assuming Dr. Lear, you mentioned, removed the implant. Then you get to study the implant. So what was this implant made out of? Like, how do we, like, what did we understand? What kind of understanding could we pull from the implant proper?
Yeah, the implant removal cases, I think, are really one of the smoking gun types of evidence we have here. And that her case is one of, I think, about 20 that he worked on personally, Dr. Roger Lear, who I met, who I knew quite well before his passing. And what's really interesting about these implant cases in hers is they have, first of all, no foreign body reaction. Normally, if someone has shrapnel or a foreign body within their tissues, it will be rejected by the body. It will be surrounded with calcium. It causes an infection and so forth.
You'd have an immune response. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And we're not seeing that in these cases.
No.
Okay. And another very interesting detail is these objects often, not always, but often have an identical appearance. So there's a consistency across the board in widely separated cases. So that's interesting. Some of these objects are apparently metallic, and an analysis of the metals shows that they're very close to meteoritic iron, which is quite odd and hard to explain. How would someone get something like that in their body? They're magnetic in several cases. And there are a few cases where these objects are actually emitting an electromagnetic signal. And they will, there's all of these different sort of really unusual aspects to them.
Just the mention of identifying iron, like the source of an iron, for example, as a material. Because iron, we know, that's not surprising to have something that's made out of metal that's made out of iron. But we can, in fact, look at the iron and do an analysis and determine where that iron came from, right? Typically, and we we're so good at it with our equipment, like earthly equipment, I mean, that we can often identify from which area the iron was mined, because there are characteristics of the iron if it's not too processed. Now, if they identified, like I haven't read the research like you haven't spoken with Dr. Lear, but if they identify it as a meteoric iron, what it says is that it's iron that you would find in meteorites, like very logically. So not something that was mined. It doesn't have that signature. It has a signature of an iron that would come from outer space. And we have plenty of that iron in different locations because meteorites fall on Earth reasonably frequently. So potentially you could find that. But evidence-wise, if you're like having a piece of equipment like that made out of specifically that iron, that is incredibly odd, as you say. If you have more than one of those implants with the same type of iron that is, foreign, that's excessively hard to explain, because you'd need, like, assuming it's a prank or whatever, right? You need a person to be able to hunt down meteoric iron, which is extremely expensive and rare and hard to come by, and then make those implants in such a way that it won't react with the immune system, which doesn't happen with iron. Like I can tell you, that's why we use titanium in bodies for implants. Some metals don't provoke immune reactions. That's why we don't use iron, because iron would absolutely create a reaction inside the body. So anyway, that's just for extra information for people out there on kind of the science and why this is relevant and important. What else of interest have they found from this case or others that are perplexing?
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert necessarily on the implant removal cases, but I have run across them. I've been sent x-rays of these objects and examined them. And this is one form of physical evidence that I think is quite persuasive, because it is consistent and this is fairly commonly reported. And it's an area that's wide open for more research, certainly. But for me, the best evidence of the reality of this phenomenon is how widespread it is, how long it's been going on. And it's not one case in particular that proves it. It's the thousands of them, hundreds of thousands even. There was one case I worked on which involved a wave of sightings over Topanga Canyon. This is from 1992 to 1994. Topanga Canyon is located outside of Los Angeles, along the coast. And it began when a bunch of people started calling the local police station and the local newspaper. And being a resident near this area, the newspaper editor called me up and asked me to investigate. And on one evening, June 14th, 1992, many people were seeing things. And so that's where I started. And on that one evening, I eventually located more than 20 separate independent adult witnesses located in different areas who all saw very unusual activity on one night. So this is the sort of thing that every investigator loves, is when you get independent corroboration from people who don't know each other, who weren't aware that there was activity going on, and you're able to sort of correlate what they saw and even triangulate it to a certain degree. So these are the kinds of cases I think that really become more and more persuasive. But yeah, it's absolutely not just eyewitness testimony. There's, of course, photographs, moving films. There are landing trace cases. And this is far more common than people realize. There are thousands of them, like the Delphos, Kansas landing trace, or the Socorro, New Mexico, in 1964, I believe it was, with a police officer, very credible witness, Lonnie Zamora. A lot of landing trace cases.
Can you explain what that is? What that is to the audience? These landing trace cases.
A landing trace case is when an object is seen on the ground, or perhaps right above it, and afterwards it has altered the terrain to some degree. This could be crushed grass, This could be marks left in the soil. This could be burnt ground. In the Lonnie Zamora case, object was clearly quite hot because it glassified the sand, actually burnt it to a high degree. There's a case in France, the Transon-Provence case, where a UFO landed on railroad ties and actually crushed them. So they were able to very accurately sort of get the weight of this object based on the damage to these railroad ties. And it was somewhere in the range of a couple of 1,000 pounds, a ton. So how would you explain that other than that there was in fact something there? So these are what we would call landing trace cases. And there are many of them. There was a case in Melbourne, Australia, 1966 at Westall High School, in which there were 200 to 300 witnesses, and high school students and teachers, who saw at least one, possibly two objects land in a grove of trees behind the school. This is Australia's most famous and most widely viewed encounter. And it left landing traces. And the lead investigator, Shane Hurd, I believe is his name, has interviewed about 100 of these witnesses who viewed these landing traces before they were, very shortly after the incident, covered up by the Australian government, who plowed it over, which does happen because there is a cover-up. This is demonstrable. It's not speculative. This has been proven through Freedom of Information documents here in the US, certainly, released by the government that are completely blacked out. The cover-up is not speculation, and it's a real problem in sort of getting your hands on hard evidence. But the landing trace cases are really numerous. There's a lot of them.
I've heard of another type of case, and I don't know what the frequency, but it's the appearance of, I guess you could call it tattoos on people's surfaces that are near some kind of an odd landing.
Yes,
things like that. Yeah,
that's another type of evidence. Yeah, this is termed medical evidence, and this is also quite common. I'd say, well, compared to the sightings, I won't call it common. Anyone having a physiological reaction to an encounter is statistically rare. But there are many hundreds of cases like this, particularly with people who have very close encounters, missing time, believe they've been taken on board, or something along these lines. It's not at all unusual for them to report scoop marks, bruises, cuts, puncture wounds. There's a very interesting case which took place in Falcon Lake, Canada. The witness is Stephen Michalik, and he came upon a landed UFO and walked up to it, at which point it took off and sent out a blast of heat, and it caught his shirt on fire, and he had to rush to the hospital because he immediately felt quite ill, started vomiting, and suffered second-degree burns. And at the hospital, his condition deteriorated quite rapidly. He began losing weight. He was nauseous. His blood lymphocyte level dropped drastically. He ended up being examined by some 40 doctors who were unable to explain his condition as anything other than what appears to be radiation sickness.
That's what I was thinking. That sounds like radiation sickness. Yeah. Not something you find like in an isolated wood somewhere when you're taking a walk. You don't really get exposed to that kind of a effect naturally.
Yes, this is sort of a very clear-cut case of medical evidence.
Yeah.
And really hard to explain. Another comes from researcher Timothy Good. He interviewed a lady by the name of Denise Bishop, who saw a UFO. This is in England. And it sent on a beam of light which struck her hand. She was temporarily paralyzed, and the beam retracted, and this UFO darted away. and her hand had a little burn on it. And at first she ignored it, but it kept getting worse and worse. Finally, she went to the doctor, and the doctor was shocked. He wanted to know how she had gotten a laser burn. He says, "This is a laser burn." And she says, "Well, this is what happened."
Maybe from a laser. I guess.
Yeah, she had not. I mean, how does one get a laser burn unless you're working in a scientific labs, which she wasn't.
Yeah.
So these are the types of cases that we term medical evidence. And those are just the injuries. There are a number which involve healings as well. And some of these are very well verified. There was a case from Bill Hamilton, prominent US-based researcher, who interviewed a lady who prefers to remain anonymous, but she was diagnosed with a cyst in her breast and had the x-rays. And it was the day before the encounter or the surgery that she had an encounter. And she doesn't really remember what happened. It was shrouded in missing time, but she went to the doctors and the tumor was gone, mysteriously disappeared. I have my own case like this as well. And there's before and after X-ray imaging to prove this.
Mm.
And in the case that I investigated, it was very similar. A lady was diagnosed with a cyst in her fallopian tubes, had an encounter again the night before surgery in her bedroom, went to the doctor, and they did the pre-imaging, which they always do. And they were very upset. And they came into the room and said, "You've had surgery." And the witness denied it. She says, no, I did not. And they said, "Well, we know you're lying. Where did you go to have surgery? Your cyst is gone." And she again denied it. And they said, "Well, here's the images. And we know you've had surgery because there's fluid here in your fallopian tube, which is only present after a person has had surgery." So this is what we would term, again, medical evidence. And there are some 300 cases documented of this. So that's something I have specialized on in my own research, are these healing cases.
It's fascinating. Huh? One has to wonder, and this is not a question we can answer, but like, why? Like in each individual case or each individual encounter, if there is an alien civilization drone or whatever, why are they doing this exactly? Healing, causing light wounds, typically not, most of them, from my understanding, are not life-threatening in most cases, but some, like the Canadian guy that got the radiation poisoning, that's pretty serious. We have the question kind of becomes like, why are they doing this? Do we have, like, again, it's hard from a rational perspective to answer this question, but do you have any idea from maybe testimonies, encounters, like, can we infer perhaps a reasoning?
Yeah, we absolutely can. And I'm not really in the business of speculating because I prefer to stick to the facts, but there are some facts that really speak towards this. And let me just briefly mention another case, which comes from Jim Schaefer from Canada, who was suffering from cancer and had a tumor on his neck, which was protruding and bone hard and growing quickly. And he was a contactee. And he had told his doctors from the beginning, like, this is happening to me, and would go to the doctor each time there was an incident where he had bruises or puncture wounds or what have you, and ask them to try and explain this, like, what is happening to me? Because I believe I'm having encounters. So many of these people who have healings aren't upfront with their doctors about this, but he was.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had this huge tumor on his neck and ended up having this orb come into his bedroom and enter into his body. And he went to sleep and woke up the next morning, and this tumor was gone. Just gone. I mean, this was shocking and impossible. So he went to the doctors, and they were understandably shocked. They proceeded with surgery to remove necrotic tissue, but found no trace of the cancer. He sent me his medical reports. So this is very well documented. And so what this tells me is he is a contactee. And this is what we see with a lot of these healing cases, is these are people who have a history of contact. Because I'm looking at all the cases and doing a statistical analysis, which I did. It's evenly divided between men and women. These cases stretch back about 100 years to the current day. They're reported all across the world. Age is not a factor. It occurs to very young children to all the way to elderly. It's not race, it's not blood type, religion, political affiliation, or education, because that's all across the board. One thing I did find, one commonality is a person's profession. And that took me a while to find because I really just wasn't looking in that direction until I kept hearing from people who claimed to have had this experience. And many of them were social workers or environmentalists or animal rights activists.
Really?
Or yes, doctors, a lot of doctors, a lot of teachers. And so I started asking, what's your profession? And often it would be this in that category of someone who is doing what I would call good work for humanity in some capacity. This is a somewhat loose pattern. I would say the biggest one is a person who has history of encounters, but occasionally there would be a one-off. And by that, I mean a person with no history of this. And then I would ask them what their job is. A good case was the lady from Norway who had grays come into her room and heal her of chronic back pain. She had an injury which severely hurt her back. And I have like 15 cases of back healings. And so I asked her, does she have a history of encounters? And she said, no, I've never seen anything like this. It was really quite frightening. They would not talk to me. She recognized them as grays because this was in the mid 1990s. And by then this was, pretty much cemented in popular culture. And asked her what she did for a living. And she said, please don't use my name because I am very active in my country doing human rights work. And that was sort of when I started to realize, okay, I wonder if this is a factor here. So for what it's worth, yeah, I that is a pattern that does turn up.
Well, it is. I mean, you did the work. We're talking statistics here, right? So there's a huge number of cases. So scientifically speaking, we're talking about a decent sample size, to look at statistically. And you have all the, I guess, very generic, categorizations that seem to be like equal across the board. You said gender, race, political affiliation, the things that we tend to think about in general terms, like in looking at a population, that there doesn't seem to be any pattern there. But all of a sudden, there is a pattern by profession. So one has to think, or at least hypothesize, that there is an intent around selecting individuals to have those experiences that happen to be in those lines of work. Or alternatively, another hypothesis would be perhaps the people that are in those lines of work tend to reveal they have encounters that with greater frequency than other professions. That is possible as well. But it does beg the question, right? Like,
Yeah.
Is there an intent? Is there an intent? Because there could be.
Yeah, another reason I feel like this is an important pattern is because there are a few cases where this was stated specifically by the ET entities.
I see.
There was a case I investigated involving an elderly couple who are from Hawaii, but were vacationing in Sedona, who had a missing time encounter and ended up going under regressive hypnosis and said that they weren't abducted at all. They were invited on board was a very friendly encounter with largely human-like ETs. And the gentleman was healed of carpal tunnel syndrome. And he was a postal worker and had, some trouble with his knees as well. And they cured all this. And the wife asked them about this. And they said, we are helping people who help others. And we can only intervene to a certain degree because it's up to humanity to solve their own problems. So that speaks towards this pattern.
Yeah.
And it does turn up quite, there's a high incidence of doctors. It turns out the wife was an alternative herbal healing specialist, I guess, or
sure. She was a doctor.
Yeah.
Alternative medicine.
So that I started looking back at all the cases, and some of the most famous cases fall under this pattern. There's a case involving 2 police officers. A lot of police officers are reporting contact. And he was healed of a flesh wound. Jacques Vallée, a very prominent and pioneering researcher, has a very famous case involving a medical doctor who was healed of an axe wound on his ankle and partial paralysis by being struck by a beam of light from one of these objects. So yeah, medical evidence can make or break a case. It's often very hard to explain any other way than this person had an encounter. But there's so many forms of evidence. I mean, we haven't even discussed radar. And there are 50, 100 cases where people are seeing an object and it is appearing on radar as well. Dr. James Mcdonald, he was an atmospheric physicist from Arizona, who was one of the first scientists to really look into this phenomenon. There were very few initially in the early ages of 1950s when this phenomenon really began to get attention. There was Jacques Vallée, of course, an astronomer. There was Dr. Leo Sprinkle from the University of Colorado, James Mcdonald, J. Allen Hynek. That's about it in terms of prominent scientists looking into this. And Dr. James Mcdonald had a case which he called the perfect case. And this was from New York, I believe. And it involved this object that was seen by 3 different pilots in different locations. They were flying at the time. It was also seen by ground witnesses, and it was caught on 2 different radar stations. And so this is a kind of case that becomes very, very hard to explain as anything other than a physical craft of some kind, because it was moving at very excessive speeds, far faster than our own aircraft. It was viewed by multiple different locations in the air and on the ground and captured on radar. So this is great evidence, and any skeptic is going to have to be able to explain this. And this is just the modern evidence. We have evidence that this goes back to at least recorded history, probably before that.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next. Thank you for leading into this, because you've been mentioning cases largely, let's say, from the 60s, by the dates you've been mentioning so far. And I remember reading about a very famous case, and I forget the city proper, but it was in the 50s over a soccer stadium in Europe. Okay, you're shaking your head because it's quite it was seen by like 50,000 people. The game stopped. Everybody was looking up at something, and there was physical evidence that kind of streamed down on the whole city on that day as well. So there were samples even taken. Before we get into the more ancient evidence, can you talk about this particular case, because it is remarkable?
Yeah, that took place in Italy. And I forget the name of the soccer stadium. This is a very well-known case. And there had been a wave of sightings both prior to this and after. But this object flew over the stadium and dropped down a material we know as angel hair.
Right. And was it Florence?
Yeah.
I have to look it up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
1954. But angel hair, yes, keep going.
Yeah, and angel hair is a very strange substance, very much kind of spider web like, or cotton candy like is how it's often been described. And these cases are very rare when you consider the totality of sightings. The number of angel hair cases is about 50 to 100, which is actually quite a bit. And there are very well-known cases all over the world. Australia has some great cases. There was a really famous case in Oloron, France. There's several cases here in the US, and I did a whole study of the angel hair phenomena because this is physical evidence. And I like the Florence case because it was so widely viewed. And I don't believe samples were collected in that case because angel hair often dissolves quite quickly. But in some cases, it is so thick and so in such large quantities that people are able to gather samples. And that was certainly true in a case in 1954 in Jerome Elementary School in Marysville, Ohio, where it just covered the playground. 1 year later at Whitsitt Elementary School, it covered the playground again. And in both cases, samples were taken. In the Jerome Elementary School case, samples were sent to Lockbourne Air Force Base, and they refused to release any details. But in the Whitsitt, North Carolina case, the teacher, the principal of the school, who was an Air Force officer, retired, but had flown some 40 combat missions and knew his aircraft and recognized that these were very unusual objects. He did gather samples and he sent them off to Burlington Scientific Labs, who was not able to identify it as any known substance and recommended that they send it to a biologist and check to see if it's spider webs, which it clearly wasn't. But he did, and the biologist said, no, this is absolutely not spider webs. We don't know what this is. But samples have been put through chemical analysis, and they revealed some really surprising properties. There's some heavy metals in these things, magnesium, aluminum. I think the most interesting one for me, at least, was boron.
Yeah,
which
isn't.
Yeah, it's not a super common element here on Earth. Certainly not just lying there on the surface of the ground.
Well, it's not something you'd find in spider webs, definitely. And then these metals, in fact, again, speaking of my own expertise, they are like here and there, on the ground, in the ground, things like in minerals and things like that. But they are, especially something like boron, definitely not in biology. We don't find that in biology. It's actually usually fairly poison. Boron compounds are poisonous to organic organisms, whereas magnesium and some of the others, like we do drink magnesium and we need magnesium, so it's around, but not at the quantities and the type of materials we're thinking about for angel hair. So
precisely. And one more thing I would just add real quickly is boron that's something we use to shield nuclear materials. Mm-hmm. Which might speak towards what these craft are and what the substance is. It's generally believed to be a byproduct of their engines or a chemical reaction due to the plasma type heat surrounding them. Honestly, we don't know. And that's why I hate to speculate, but there's scientific proof that something very odd is going on here.
Well, just the fact that you have this material with that type of composition falling from the sky, covering school grounds and kind of dissipating, there's no rationale, natural explanation for the presence of such delivered in that way in those quantities. there's absolutely no sense. I know from the Florence case, the prevailing explanation from authorities was, it's a huge, was it a spider nest? Because there's some spiders that make nests that sometimes float in the air for short periods of time. And so, well, it's just a big one, and it explains kind of like there's a lot of the spider web that shed all over the city. That's the official take of it. But taking the samples, and I did discover from the Florence case, I think there were some people that took some samples, or maybe it's my information is wrong, that discovered kind of the same thing that you described from the American cases. There were metals in there that shouldn't be there. That definitely shouldn't be there, especially not in spider webs, which are made of protein, which definitely don't have any boron or magnesium in it. So, but that's really interesting. But let's go back a little bit. You're mentioning like thousands of years. So, I mean, the type of evidence we can gather from, let's say, 2,000, 3,000 years ago is very different from what we can gather in contemporary cases. So what can we infer from interactions with ET based on whatever evidence we may have from ancient history?
Yeah. Just a quick aside before we go there, I would mention that there are other forms of evidence as well, such as animal reaction evidence, because animals will react to an object, and this is often what will pull people outside. And I would also say there's electromagnetic effect cases where machines are shut down or even damaged in some way. Car engines shut off, televisions becoming staticky, radios. All kinds of electromagnetic influence. But as far as, so many different forms of evidence, and historical evidence is also very numerous, and it's largely circumstantial, but that's still evidence. And it is quite varied. We have very ancient cultures, such as Egyptian culture, in which there are hieroglyphs which clearly show what appear to be UFOs or alien entities. There's also, I would point towards the Vimyanas of ancient India, in which they talked about flying craft. And there are areas which have been located across our planet, which show what appear to be evidence of atomic fusion, or areas in the desert which are glassified, which could only be done by something of that temperature. And it's very hard to explain as anything other than that. And so that would be the earliest, I think, the sort of pre-recorded, prehistory evidence. And it goes onward from there. There are petroglyphs from numerous indigenous cultures across the world, which show what look like your modern day gray aliens. And very hard to explain. There are stone and metal artifacts that look just like, say, the space shuttle, or aircraft, saucer-shaped craft. And these are objects that we know are many thousands of years old. And it just goes onward from there.
Some could say, Preston, being the devil's advocate here, it's like, okay, like we've found petroglyphs and paintings on walls that depict, let's say, grays, what looks like people in astronauts or with mechanical things. They would say, well, that's just the ancient creative, the ancient artist kind of painting whatever's in the person's imagination. The architect that does something, weird people telling stories, fantastic stories of gods and different things. It's all in their imagination at the time, and then through word of mouth and also culture, we've kind of carried these stories with us along the years and generations. And that's why we have this repetition of imagery or stories throughout time, kind of explaining a bit the mythos around aliens and seeing things and things like that. So what do you say to that argument based on your research and your
it doesn't hold water, because what we see with the cave paintings are accurate representations of what they actually saw. or we're not seeing something that's phantasmagorical or doesn't exist. They are drawing bison, or they are drawing the animals largely and the things that they saw. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's true across the board, because this is something that's very hard to investigate, having occurred so long ago. But by and large, these appear to be accurate representations of what they actually saw. These cave paintings in particular, and petroglyphs, are showing what they saw at the time they were there. And there's also ancient writings. The Vijnanas of ancient Egypt is not so much petroglyphs, it's writings, or ancient India, sorry. This appears in their actual written records. And we can go to the Middle Ages, and there are wood carvings of events that appear to be huge UFO waves. And these are very clear in their depiction of UFOs, round objects flying across the sky. It cannot be interpreted any other way. The Romans, we know that this was seen in Roman culture. They called them flying shields.
Yeah.
So each culture sort of grapples with trying to interpret this. And the idea of extraterrestrials and life on other planets was something that sort of was not really in the popular culture thousands and thousands of years ago. Often it was interpreted as a religious event, perhaps, or an astronomical event of some kind. They did not know how to interpret it. But so you do see sort of a cultural bias, perhaps, or people looking at it through the lens of their belief system at that time. And so we're probably still seeing that today to some extent. Because there does seem to be an aspect of, how we interpret the universe is through our belief system and what we've learned. But now I think we're at a much more scientifically based culture. We've really advanced technologically. We've come to understand what stars are. We know there are other suns. We are beginning to realize how vast this universe is. And the whole, there are theories to explain extraterrestrials and UFOs that are, like not extraterrestrials. So some will say, perhaps it's a interdimensional thing, or perhaps this is an intelligence that's putting on different masks and so forth. But I will tell you, if you examine all the evidence in its totality, I think the extraterrestrial theory is by far the most popular, certainly among researchers and experiencers, but it's also the theory that best explains the totality of the evidence. And one thing I would point to, just as a tangent, are the crash retrieval reports. Everyone has probably heard of Roswell, the UFO crash in New Mexico in 1947, which is based entirely on eyewitness testimony. We don't have access to the bodies or the craft in the public arena. But we do have some 300 eyewitness testimonies of people who saw the thing come down, saw it on radar, guarded the material, picked up the material, transported the material, examined the material. So really across the board, this particular incident, the Roswell incident, has been tracked from beginning to end. And it's an excellent case. It's really one of the most famous cases in the world. But it is not unique. In fact, there are well over 100 cases like it, probably closer to 1,000. And it's not just in the US, it's in Canada, it's in England, it's Russia. I mean, you name it. There are a lot of cases like this. And this is the absolute conclusive, undeniable, hard evidence of the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. The only unfortunate aspect of it is this is relying on eyewitness testimony at this point. But if true, and I think there's enough testimony to say that it is, all bets are off. We know what this is. It's absolute conclusive evidence. And once this is released by our governments, if ever, I think at some point it will have to be. I mean, this is no longer a mystery. It's almost disingenuous at this point to say, oh, we don't know what this is. We do. Our governments absolutely know what this is and have 100% conclusive proof of it.
See, that leads to, I guess, another point of discussion around this. Like with this body of evidence, and some of which, as you mentioned, is not in the public domain. Some of the stronger piece of evidence, but there's plenty of evidence strong evidence that is public domain. If we set our minds to acknowledging, this fact that there's plenty of encounters, interactions with an intelligence that is beyond the Earth or from somewhere else, they have an interaction with us. So if we just acknowledge that, I guess the following question is, well, what should we do about it, right? And because there's multiple opinions about that. Some people are currently they're pondering, okay, we're not alone in the universe, and therefore we must protect ourselves, like in a defensive stance, right, against possible aggression and invasion and so on. Others, like the alliance's stand, is like, okay, like we want to communicate and have like a discussion, diplomatic contact, and how do we go about doing that? And there's other opinions about it. Some of them saying like, no, leave us alone, we don't want to, or whatever, right? So what are your thoughts about what now?
Yeah, and I think this is really important and why the Alliance organization is so vital, because this is, I think, really the forefront of the whole UFO movement. I think disclosure is something that is very important, that we need to really persuade and convince and urge our governments to be truthful and transparent and forthcoming on this subject. That is vital, because I do not think we will have open official contact until we get, more steps towards truthfulness within our own governments. So I think that's one of the reasons for the whole disclosure movement, which is really gaining steam right now, because there's a lot of pressure on all sides. A lot of people are experiencing this. People might think like UFO contact is not common. You would be wrong. J. Allen Hynek, who was really, again, one of the first scientists to look in this, is quoted as saying 1 in 40 people have had an onboard UFO encounter. On board.
Okay.
And I thought, well, no, that's far too many. How could you say that? I mean, that sounds incredible. That's millions of people. And that's one of the things that really got me to investigate this more deeply. And I asked everyone I knew, because I knew 40 people, and I found 5 people within my circle, family, friends, and coworkers, who had this experience. So I thought, okay, perhaps Hynek was correct. And I ended up surveying and examining the research of all the prominent researchers. And I wrote an article for the MUFON Journal called 1 in 40, basically pointing out like Jacques Vallée agrees with this, and Bud Hopkins and other prominent researchers are saying this is far more common than people realize. And it was a year after that the Roper Survey organization decided to do a formal survey. And they found 1 in 50 people show the markers, which is very close to what J. Allen Hynek estimated. So I would say that this is much more common than people realize. Going back to your question, is what can we do about this? Because we have collected the evidence. And we have enough evidence now to, I think, persuade anybody that this is a real phenomenon. And that has been the focus for the last 50, 70 years, is let's just collect evidence. Well, we have it now. So where do we go from here? And this is why I think another aspect of the whole UFO movement is really gaining steam, which is the Ce5 movement.
Right. Yeah.
And this, by that, I mean close encounters of the fifth kind, as it's been termed, which is initiating contact, human initiated contact, which is all what about the Alliance is about. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is really where we're going to have to put more effort. This is, I think, where we'll have the most success, the most pay dirt. It's got the most potential to it. And it's already having a lot of really exciting events in this. Many, many people are doing this now and getting really good evidence of contact. Widely viewed incidents, photographed, filmed. There's a lot of people doing this all across the planet currently today. And I think this is where we're probably going to have the real disclosure. I'm not so sure our governments are going to do it willingly. The disclosure we're having today has been largely done through leaks within government, whistleblowers, which is forcing the governments of the world to sort of kicking and screaming, dragging their feet to make official statements about this. And I am glad to see that there is now actual movement within governments to talk about the subject. But it's clear that they're not being fully forthcoming. So I am not sure they ever will, certainly not willingly. And that's why I think the whole, reaching out to the ETs movement is so, so important. And that is where I think we're going to have the most success. I think that's where we're going to start having honest and true diplomatic relations with ETs. And I believe that will happen within our generation. I think we are on the cusp of that, and we will have open official contact with humanity at large. And it will change the world in a way that's almost,
it's a seminal moment in the history of humanity.
It will absolutely change everything.
I had a comment on this because we at the Alliance, of course, this is part of the mission, right? It's just to some of our organizations are Ce5 organizations, and we support that fully because that's part of the mission. It's contact, and our milestone mission is the actual embassy, which means it's interacting with political leaders that are reluctant to be public about it because it's still that kind of mood. They don't want to be discredited and things like that. But that mood is changing. The United Nations and whatnot. So there's a movement towards all of that. But what I find very interesting is that there seems to be, and you can tell me because you're looking more at the statistics more than I, is there seems to be an increase in activity, in UFO activity over a number of years, the last few years being more prominent, and there's more and more activity from the Ce5s and the other organizations in doubling their effort in trying to make contact. So is there an increase in appearance? Like, is there a kind of a correlation between what we're doing and UFO sightings in the recent years? Does it seem, from a statistic point of view, does it seem to be trending towards some kind of seminal moment as you describe it?
Yeah, I think so. And this is going towards speculation, which I hesitate to do, but let's just look at the numbers. So we have here in the US, two main UFO research organizations, civilian. There's the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, and the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC. And their numbers just flat out facts show a steady rise of reports, which would seem to indicate very much so that there is a steady rise of actual cases. But this can be interpreted in another way, in that there's an increased awareness of this subject, which motivates people to report it in larger numbers. And I think it's probably a little of both. That's where we have to speculate. But the facts show that, yes, there are more cases. And I think if you look at it very objectively, you will see that we have activity that's largely historically unprecedented. If you go back through hundreds of years of history, yes, you can locate many, many historical accounts. But what you do not see are these constant waves of sightings every 5 years or so. 1954, France was inundated. Belgium had a wave in the 1990s. There's waves across the US. Gulf Breeze had waves in Hudson Valley, New York. There was the wave over Phoenix, Arizona. Wytheville, Virginia had a huge wave. Topanga Canyon, I mentioned earlier. Mexico City had a giant wave of sightings in 1991. And so this is, in essence, a publicity campaign, I think, on the part of the ETs, who did try to initiate diplomatic relations with world leaders. We know this from whistleblower accounts. And because our governments have covered this up, have refused to be truthful about it, I think the ETs are doing what amounts to a grassroots movement. So this is largely historically unprecedented. We do not see throughout history large numbers of people reporting being taken on board. The accounts just aren't there. Whether this is because back in historical times, people weren't as well educated, literate, so to speak, able to read and write, and history wasn't recorded quite as comprehensively as it is today. That could be a factor, but I still think there would be more evidence of it. So I do think what we're dealing with is, yes, an absolute escalation of activity, which is quite urgent on the parts of the ETs, who I think are really concerned about how we're treating our planet, because it's clear from wherever you look for knowledge, whether it's just mainstream scientists or what have you, that we are destroying our environment, that we are so warlike that we're at the point where we could actually destroy ourselves. We could cause an existential crisis. And I will say this is the number one message that contactees receive when they are taken on board. The number one message consistently across the board from the 1950s onwards. So yeah, we're at a crucial time now. This is why I think the Alliance is so important. And this, educating people about the subject and getting people to realize we are not alone. We have never been alone. There is not an ET threat. They are not here to take over. I see no good, compelling evidence that this is something that is a nefarious, aggressive, or evil phenomenon. It has been around so very long. There's no evidence that they're here to hurt us or take us over or eat us for lunch or anything like that. I think the only ET threat really is from the people who are covering this up. And they realize that this, their position, of being able to cover this up is being threatened by the increased escalation of activity. That's the ET threat. It's to their position of power and control over the populace.
Yeah.
So I think that's why they're putting forth an ET threat narrative, which they are.
Yeah.
And it's unwarranted.
And their agenda for funding, position, whatever else to put more fear into the minds of people. Fear has been used by leadership of all types, religion, political or whatever, to to get people in line and kind of lined up and kind of do what they want. That's the kind of a historical truth
and it's unsupported. If you look at the actual elements of ET contact objectively, what happens to people who have contact, you will see that it is not aggressive, nefarious, or evil in any way. It can be very scary for people who are taken on board, physically examined.
I would surmise it would be traumatic.
Yeah, and largely because we are trained to fear. The media is very fear-based and will air any stories where people, they love fear. But if you actually look at what happens to people, they're physically examined, they're healed, they are given a tour of the craft, they're shown the engine room, told that we don't need fossil fuels. They are given warnings, as I mentioned, about nuclear proliferation, about our warlike ways, about the destruction of our environment. And in addition to that, there's a very, very strong spiritual component to the ET contact, which is often underplayed and overlooked and ignored by many researchers, even today, who are still very intent on trying to prove this as a nuts and bolts phenomena. When in fact, yes, the ETs are very advanced technologically, but they're very advanced spiritually. And by and large, as a general rule, people who have encounters, there's a very, very strong spiritual component to it. They come back from their experiences spiritually transformed. Their lives are changed. People who are perhaps ultra religious or fundamentalist religious will move away from that towards a more open spiritual view. And they start to realize that the human organism, the human being, is unlimited in our abilities, and start to wake up to things such as life after death, out-of-body experiences, alternative healing, precognition, telepathy. All of these things are natural human abilities, which have been largely suppressed and not talked about. And it's really important that people wake up to who we truly are as immortal beings with these abilities. And once we wake up our intuitive abilities, this is when we're going to see corruption fall to the wayside. This is when we're going to see the unequal distribution of wealth go away, the divisiveness of politics and religion and race disappear. That's the number one message from that and environmentalism from the ETs, is that we are all one, that there is no true difference between us. We're not different races. We're different ethnicities. We're one race.
Yeah. And this is something that surprised me a whole lot when we created the Alliance in the first place. We started reaching out to organizations and people that had a similar mandate, Ce5, meeting aliens and diplomatic contact and so on. Started talking to contactees, leaders of these groups that have similar intent. And there was, to my surprise, there was a very, very strong unifying philosophy of how they saw the world as a collective, as groups and individuals that had this strong desire to welcome an extraterrestrial civilization. And two words almost always come up as this word of being one, being unified, and we're all the same. We're all together here on the planet Earth. The animals, plants, ETs, the universe. It's all one big interactive playground with no divisions, and everything's kind of supposed to play with each other with respect and so on. And the second aspect, which surprised me more, and it's something that's because I guess the unification it can be an intellectual exercise or justification more than philosophical to some. But the other part, part that comes out is love. That word comes out from contactees, like you mentioned, the message they receive and what they feel from the interaction, even though there's no spoken word. and just generally that transformational moment when they switched from being like hardcore entrepreneur to having an experience and then switching over to like completely different way of seeing the world. They talk about love, love being the defined as giving and sharing with others with no expectation of return, right? So you have these communities that are kind of forming around each other that have this ideology, this philosophy through contact and exposure to ideas and whatnot. And it's amazing to see. I did not expect that. I expected a lot more groups that are just fundamentally, okay, we want to rationally meet contact, but there's not that many of those people out there. Most people that are encountered that have the same mandate are very, very philosophical in how they're thinking. So again, speculatively, because we are speculating outside of the evidence a little bit, but it does kind of is informed by the evidence that there is some sort of plan from an organization, from the ET's part, in why they are here. And I wrote myself because I'm also a published author, and one of my most referred to articles is about whether or not aliens that would come here would be aggressive. Is there any rationale to it? Like, I'm just painting the very rational picture of like, is there a rational reason for it? Assuming the difference in technology and what we know of the universe. And the only reason I could come up with writing the article was religion. Literally. If they had some kind of religion, some kind of dogma that would de-rationalize their behavior, as religions sometimes do, right? And consider us either a threat, that we shouldn't exist, or whatever, like some irrational type of justification that would give them some kind of irrational reason to come here and cause harm, unless there would be some kind of religious thing going on. It doesn't matter what how they eat, what they eat, how they live, how they survive, like biologically or whatever. It doesn't matter. There's no rational reason for them to come here to do anything else than be helpful or interactive or want to meet. They don't need us. They don't need the planet Earth or anything on it, because the universe is filled with all that stuff. And they can find an infinity of materials anywhere else in the universe, closer to their star system, most likely. And what machines or behaviors they can get out of artifice, biological or mechanical, they can build themselves on their own more than they can borrow or steal from us, because they're way more advanced technologically if they can travel the stars. So, and that's just like kind of like a very interesting, exploration of the why. Why do we have, if that is the case, there's no rational reason for them to be aggressive. What is the rational reason for them to be here in the first place? Maybe it is philosophy. Maybe there is, from ancient history, a connection between us and them. Maybe we are more similar than we think. Maybe we have a strong history. And being a fan of ancient history personally, I like to look at similarities in the stories and in the mythology of peoples. And of course, this is all just stories. We can make it a whole bunch of, we can rationalize in multiple ways. But I keep looking at patterns in different parts of the world where it was impossible for them to communicate with each other. And they all seem to have developed thousands of years ago pantheons of gods of different forms that have very human characteristics to them. And their stories talk about direct interaction with these people. And sometimes the interaction is very clearly created and creator, which is what basically caused some of the God versus created kind of stories and some of the religions possibly. But that's dispersed throughout all sorts of peoples in different parts of the world. And I've always asked myself, is that the reason, ET actually have such interest with us in particular? Why are they putting all these efforts in to kind of like marketing campaign, like you described it? Why do they care that we destroy the environment on this planet? There's billions of planets out there. There's probably life in a whole bunch of other places, created scientifically or otherwise. Why do they care about us so much? And we have to think about that. It's like, we don't know the answer for real. Like, there's a bunch of reasons, and I have my own belief system around that. But it's just a belief system. But we have to ask, like, as rational beings, it's like, why us? Why do they care so much? Why do they abduct these social workers and try to fix them so that they can continue on their work? Why are they changing the people's minds? Why are they active doing that? Why do they care? It doesn't impact them on the universal scale. It doesn't affect them at all in their own civilization, which is somewhere else completely. Why is that? Why is it? So there is a reason. And perhaps if we look hard enough at our history, we have a bunch of evidence of being in contact or having a closer relationship with a more advanced civilization in the past. Maybe that's it. Maybe we were created by scientists from another planet, just like we're able to do it in another planet really soon, because we're getting really good at DNA and manipulation. Maybe that's it. I don't know from a scientific point of view. I can't point out to evidence that traces back like breadcrumbs to that. But there's a lot of stories that kind of connect the dots that are really interesting. Maybe that's the why. I don't know. Any thoughts on that in particular while we close this discussion?
Yeah. I think you're circling around the central issue there. Is why? And I think, well, let's look at the reports. First of all, the entities we're dealing with are humanoid, almost exclusively. Universally, people are reporting figures with a head and eyes and a nose and a mouth, 2 arms, 2 legs, very much like us. It's when I first got into this field, I'm like, well, this is sort of anthropocentric. This is very much, could this be true? Or it's just, how come they're so much like us? And in fact, there are many different types of humanoids reported. Certainly the grays, even praying mantis type are still humanoid. But absolutely, what we're human-looking beings look just like us. And that raises serious implications and questions. Like, okay, if we have beings out there that look just like us, exactly, who are we? Where did we come from? What does this say about human origins? What does this say about our relationship to the ETs? Why are they so interested in us? Because that is something we do know. They are interested in all things Earth, all things human. So many people have been taken on board, physically examined. They're very interested in our emotions. They're collecting our plants. They're collecting animals. We know they are obsessed with humans and Earth. And why? Why would they be? And I think this points towards the fact that we probably have a much closer relationship with them than might be immediately apparent. I feel like the ETs, and I'm speculating here only, is that do understand, being very spiritually advanced, that we are all one, that we are all intrinsically, integrally connected. That the separations that we view between, individuals and families and nations and cities and countries is largely illusory. We are much more closely connected, I think, than we realize. We're very much compartmentalized in our thinking and in our consciousness here on Earth. But as people become more spiritually evolved, they start to realize the importance of love, how truly connected we are. And I think that is really where the answer probably lies. and that the ETs look upon us as brothers, as sisters, as friends, as children, as, comrades. We are all one, and it is, their law is moral law. It's ethics. It's do the right thing. And this is, I think, is why they are reaching out and trying to help us as much as they can without violating our free will, because it is up to us to solve our own problems. And as any parent knows, if you do all the heavy lifting for your child, if you tie their shoes, if you spoon feed them, they will not be able to get themselves dressed. They need to learn how to brush their own teeth. They need to learn how to support themselves. And that's why I think we have sort of this limited contact, which is in some way laissez-faire. It's very much, okay, do your own thing. Well, we're watching over you, and we will help to a limited degree. They're not healing everybody. They're not coming down and sharing their technology, but they are absolutely announcing their presence in a very widespread way and sort of giving us little signs and roadmaps to how we can evolve spiritually and technologically. And I think they're doing it as friends, as family. And I think that's really the answer to this. There's a very well-known contactee, Betty Andreason, and she has a gray that she's in contact with called Quasgod. And he told her basically all this, and he said, love is the answer for humankind. Direct quote from a gray alien. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the ultimate force behind all this. It's love. It's the ethical and moral imperative to help anyone in need, which we all have. Anyone who trips and falls, all of us will quickly rush forward and help that person up. It's what we do. Mm-hmm. And I think by and large, people on Earth are good. So I'm really encouraged. I mean, I know we've got some real problems here on our planet, but I think it's a very small percentage of people who have seized power and really desire to control others and are causing all kinds of havoc. But ultimately, we, the people, have the power to come together and recognize that we are immortal beings, that we are connected to the ETs, that they are watching over us. We are them, they are us. And ultimately, I think that is the reason behind contact, is because there is no separation between us. We are ETs ourselves. Every ET in the universe looks as humans as ETs. I mean, because we are. I mean, and just the whole universe is filled with life. Just look at the stars out there. It's clear we're not alone. That would be phantasmagorically almost impossible in terms of odds that we would be alone in this universe.
From a there's a lot of our articles that talk about probabilities, because it's an inexact science regarding the emergence of life, and there's a bunch of assumptions that have to be made and so on. So it's certainly very, very, the answers vary a lot. But one of the more credible or statistical analysis that I found, that I like to quote the numbers determined that it was more of a negative stat. It's like say, well, the chances that we are alone in the Milky Way is about 1 in 60 billion. Or something like that, based on the assumptions that the author was making specifically, and that to me kind of like, I like that type of thinking, because we don't know how many, let's say in 50 years, right? We'll have such a grasp of DNA and engineering that we'll be able to create life ourselves, humanoid, plants, animals, you name it. We'll be able to go somewhere else or here, whatever, we can create life. Just knowing that we can do it ourselves means that any civilization that has either evolved or has also been, fathered, let's say, by another civilization, with enough technology, can do the same. So we don't depend, and it kind of annoys me that scientists ignore this possibility. They talk, well, the evolutionary emergence of life elsewhere. Well, technically, if you give enough time, you only need one. Because then they develop technology and they can like sprout life everywhere, just like a lot of science fiction movie kind of talk about. And then all of a sudden, instead of just talking about probabilities of one civilization emerging somewhere through evolution, you're talking about how many you got. Like it can be infinite number of civilizations that have been fathered in many ways, just like we'll probably do ourselves with, like right now we're primitives compared to some civilizations in the universe, most likely. But we're getting there. We're getting to figuring stuff out. And, to close, I like to think, because we're talking about these, the impressions of ETs and us and who's the ET, right? Really. And I like to think about Gene Roddenberry's work. Like I'm a big Star Trek fan because I love the kind of imagery and the thought process that he puts into his show. And especially, I grew up with Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? Not so much the original series. And in The Next Generation, they talk in a lot of episodes. They talk about the Prime Directive, right? When you meet a civilization that's less advanced, well, you have to let them, figure it out and then kind of come out of their planet and technology and be ready for an encounter, right? In some way. And then you announce yourself. And if you don't do that, it causes a lot of problems. And that's from the creative mind of Gene Roddenberry as an ideology. But perhaps it applies here, right? In the same way, although we're not the ones that are warping around, we're the primitives. We're the civilization that are trying to come to grasp with the possibility of not being alone. And how are we going to reach out? And the governments don't want to; they're covering things up. But a lot of population kind of start wanting to make contact. Are less and less fearful. I forget the stat from last year, or maybe it was this year, but I think it was 65% of the North American population believe that there's a intelligent life out there. That doesn't sound like much to some in our area of discussion. But you just compare that number from like 2, 3, 5 years ago, it's a big difference. There's been huge statistical difference in our perception of whether or not we're alone. Are we afraid? And do we want to have encounters and things like that? That mentality has shifted a lot in just the last few years. So if we take the Prime Directive principle, let's say, and assume that this is what's happening from the other side, right? They're kind of watching us, kind of poking the bear, so to speak. And it's like, just adding information, marketing campaign, kind of like seeing what's going on, but letting us decide. When we cross that threshold, there's some kind of threshold of understanding and acceptance and welcoming as a population. I think governments will reveal all sorts of information, because then, they would be probably applauded by the general population from doing so, and therefore there's motivation to do so. But also it kind of sets the stage and the cue for an observing ET civilization to say, okay, not only does the most of the population want us to appear officially, and they won't be freaking out so much, but also the governments, the leadership that have access to weapons that could cause harm to their own people or to each other due to the trauma, let's say, of an encounter, such a seminal moment, that's all kind of gone away or calmed down. Okay, let's do it now. Like the assumption, at least from my end, is that they're waiting for things to kind of boil to a certain level on Earth with our own thinking, and then they'll make contact, just like Prime Directive and Star Trek episodes. Again, it's not like I have evidence of this is actually the plan, but it makes sense to me that if I were on their side, and therefore, we're at the Alliance and all the partner organizations, we're focused on yes, putting the physical elements in place so that there's a means of diplomatic contact that we understand as human society, but also that there is the mindset change that happens within the population that will allow an alien civilization that has all the time in the world for us to make our own mind to say, okay, now it's time, now they're ready. Because it's not like we can provoke them into doing anything. They have full control over their own destiny. We're the ones scrambling.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
So when we're ready, then when they're ready, they're going to show, and they're going to do something else more directly. We're assuming, and until then, it's really on us to evolve, I guess, would be the proper word, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not the ET threat; it's the human threat.
Yeah,
we need to overcome our warlike ways. I think that's one of the real main barriers to open official contact. Once we come together, once we have governments which are much more working towards the interest of all than greed and power, I think we will have open official contact. And one way or another, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm going to have a frontline seat. I want to be there when that happens.
Yeah, and I think it will. Progress has a way of moving forward. If you know what I mean. And just look at humanity. We are doing really well in terms of how far we've come. And we are now waking up to the idea that, the unequal distribution of wealth and the divisiveness and the pollution of our planet. We are really taking huge strides towards solving these problems.
Sometimes it doesn't seem like it. If you only watch the news, and because it's mostly negative and of course fear-based, but if you look at statistics, if you look at data, how we are actually doing quite well and improving every year,
historically speaking.
For those of us that look at data, not TikTok and Facebook.
Yeah, go back a couple of hundred years, life was very brutal.
Oh yeah,
people were treated horribly. There was a lot worse in terms of human rights and pollution and our understanding of the universe. We've come real far. So I'm very hopeful about humanity. I think we can do it. And I think we're going to see a much brighter future as long as we continue to strive to come together and let love and truth and compassion guide our every action. It's pretty simple. Do the right thing.
I think that's a great way to end this forum on love, compassion, and unification, and what we should be doing next. Thank you so much for being here, Preston. It was great. Guys, if you want to check out his work, I'm going to put down in the description, but also in line in the video, Preston's web address. So you can go check out all his publications, his books. Be aware that there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of information we can gather, and we'll keep working together as a human community, as a friggin' universal community, towards good and love. Do the right thing, right? Very simple, and I think we'll make it. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.